and the baby seemed determined to use her ribs as a soccer goal. But she'd insisted on keeping their tradition. Third wedding anniversary. It had to mean something. "Marcus," she said softly, adjusting her maternity dress. "Could you put that away just for dinner?" Marcus Wellington didn't look up from his phone screen. His dark hair was perfectly styled, his expensive suit tailored to perfection. At 38, he still drew appreciative glances from other women in the restaurant. Victoria used to feel proud walking beside him. Now she mostly felt invisible. "This deal is crucial. Vic, you know how important my work is?" His fingers flew across the screen, typing something that made him smile. That smile used to make her heart flutter. Tonight, it made her stomach twist. "I know your work is important," Victoria said, keeping her voice level. Years as a prosecutor had taught her to stay calm under pressure. "But tonight is about us, about our family." She placed both hands on her belly. "About Emma." They'd finally agreed on the name last week. Emma Rose Sterling Wellington. Victoria had wanted to hyphenate, maintaining her identity alongside her new role as Marcus's wife and a mother. He'd argued, of course, but eventually conceded. Small victories. Marcus glanced up briefly, his blue eyes cold. "The baby isn't going anywhere, Victoria, but this opportunity might." His attention returned to the phone immediately. Victoria watched her husband's face in the candlelight. When had he become a stranger? When had his ambition transformed from attractive drive into consuming narcissism? When had she become just another accessory in his perfect life? "I feel like we're disconnected lately," she said, reaching across the table. "Like we're living separate lives." "We are living separate lives," Marcus replied without thinking, then seemed to realize how harsh that sounded. "I mean, you're focused on the pregnancy, and I'm building our future. It's temporary." Temporary. Everything felt temporary these days. Her career as a prosecutor, put on hold for motherhood, her independence, slowly eroded by Marcus's need to control every decision, her sense of self, buried beneath layers of compromise and accommodation. "Marcus, look at me." Victoria's voice carried a hint of her old courtroom authority. "Please." He finally looked up, irritation flickering across his handsome features. "What?" "Victoria, what do you want me to say? I want you to talk to me like you used to. Like I matter. Like we matter." "Of course you matter. You're carrying my child." The phrase hit her like a slap. Not their child, his child, as if she were merely the vessel, not an equal partner in creating new life. Victoria's phone buzzed with a text from her sister Rebecca. "How's dinner? Is he being romantic?" She glanced at Marcus, still absorbed in his device, and typed back, "Define romantic." "Victoria," Marcus's voice was sharp now, "if you're going to be on your phone too, then we might as well." "I was texting Rebecca back. One text." Victoria set her phone face down on the table. "Unlike some people, I can focus on my family." Marcus's jaw tightened. Several diners at nearby tables glanced over, sensing tension. Chez Laurent prided itself on refined atmosphere. Raised voices were decidedly unrefined. "Don't lecture me about family," Marcus said, his voice low but dangerous. "Everything I do is for this family. Every deal, every meeting, every sacrifice. While you've been sitting at home, Victoria's prosecutor instincts flared. "I'm growing your child. I gave up my career for your child. I moved across the country away from my family for your career." "Our child," Marcus corrected, but it felt hollow. "And you didn't give up your career. You're taking a break. A break that's lasted 2 years. Because you wanted to focus on getting pregnant." The conversation was spiraling into familiar territory. The same arguments, the same recriminations, the same fundamental disconnect about what their marriage had become. Victoria took a deep breath, trying to channel her mother's judicial calm. Judge Eleanor Sterling never lost her composure, never let emotion cloud her judgment. Victoria needed that strength now. "Marcus, I love you. I love our life together. But I feel like I'm disappearing, like I'm becoming someone I don't recognize." For a moment, something flickered in Marcus's eyes. Regret, understanding. But then his phone buzzed again, and his attention fractured. "Can we talk about this at home? This deal, What deal? Victoria leaned forward, her legal mind catching something in his tone. You said it was the Morrison account. Marcus's fingers stilled on his phone screen. It is the Morrison account. Then why does your phone say Amber? The name hung in the air between them like smoke. Marcus's face went pale, then red, then cold as stone. You're reading my messages now. Your phone is right there. The notification popped up. Victoria felt ice spreading through her chest. Who is Amber? A colleague. What kind of colleague texts you at 9 o'clock on our anniversary? Marcus's composure cracked slightly. Victoria, you're being paranoid. Pregnancy hormones. Don't. Victoria's voice cut through his excuse like a blade. Don't you dare blame this on hormones. Who is she? The silence stretched between them, filled with the soft murmur of other diners, the clink of silverware, the whisper of expensive fabric. Victoria watched her husband's face transform from defensive to angry to something darker. She's nobody, Marcus said finally. A business contact, but his phone buzzed again and again, and Victoria saw enough of the screen to know these weren't business messages. Let me see your phone. Absolutely not. Marcus. Victoria's voice carried all the authority she'd once wielded in courtrooms, cross-examining hostile witnesses. Let me see your phone. No, Victoria, you don't get to make demands. You don't get to interrogate me like some criminal. The word hung between them, loaded with meaning, because Victoria had interrogated criminals. She knew the signs of deception, the tells that betrayed guilt, and Marcus was broadcasting guilt like a neon sign. If there's nothing to hide, there's nothing to hide. Marcus's voice rose enough that nearby diners turned to stare. He noticed and lowered his tone, but his eyes blazed with anger. But I won't be treated like a suspect in my own marriage. Victoria felt something shift inside her, some fundamental understanding about the man she'd married. The control, the secrecy, the way he made her feel crazy for noticing obvious inconsistencies. This was who he really was. The charming, successful, devoted husband had been a performance. How long? She asked quietly. How long what? How long have you been lying to me? Marcus stood abruptly, his chair scraping loudly across the marble floor. His movement was violent enough that Victoria instinctively leaned back, one hand moving to protect her belly. I'm not doing this, Marcus said, his voice carrying across the restaurant. I'm not sitting here while my pregnant wife accuses me of God knows what. Other patrons were openly staring now. The maitre d' was moving toward their table with diplomatic concern. Victoria felt heat flooding her cheeks, but also a strange clarity. This was Marcus's pattern escalate until she backed down. Make her the problem. Force her to apologize for his behavior. Not tonight. Sit down, Marcus. Let's talk about this calmly. Don't tell me what to do. Marcus's face was flushed, his carefully styled hair falling across his forehead. Don't use that prosecutor voice on me. I'm not prosecuting you. I'm trying to understand what that you've become paranoid and controlling, that pregnancy has made you irrational. The words hit Victoria like physical blows. Irrational, paranoid, controlling. All the things he'd been calling her lately whenever she asked reasonable questions or expressed reasonable concerns. I'm 8 months pregnant with your child, Victoria said, rising slowly from her chair. I deserve honesty from my husband. You deserve what I give you. Marcus's mask was slipping completely now, revealing something ugly underneath. You live in my house, spend my money, wear clothes I buy, maybe show some gratitude instead of playing detective. Victoria stood frozen, her hands cradling her belly, staring at this man she'd promised to love forever. The restaurant had gone quiet around them, a bubble of shocked silence surrounding their table. I want to go home, she said quietly. Good. Maybe you'll come to your senses. Victoria reached for her purse and coat, moving carefully with her pregnant body. Every step felt deliberate, final. She was walking away from more than just dinner. She was walking away from the illusion of her marriage. Marcus watched her struggle with her coat, making no move to help. His phone buzzed again, and his eyes flicked down automatically. Amber again, Victoria asked. That's when Marcus grabbed her wrist. Victoria tried to pull away, but Marcus's grip tightened. His fingers wrapped around her wrist like a vice, the pressure just short of painful, but unmistakably controlling. Let go of me, Victoria said, her voice low but carrying clearly in the hushed restaurant. We're not done talking. Marcus's face was inches from hers now, his breath carrying the scent of expensive wine and barely controlled rage. You don't get to walk away from me. Victoria looked down at his hand on her wrist, then back up at his face. In her prosecutor days, she'd seen this moment countless times in domestic violence cases. The moment when control became physical, the moment when emotional abuse crossed the line into something darker. Marcus, her voice was steady despite the fear creeping up her spine. Let go of my wrist. Now. Oh, or what you'll call your mommy the judge. The sneer in his voice made something cold settle in Victoria's chest. Judge Eleanor Sterling had raised her daughters to be strong, independent women. She'd also taught them to recognize dangerous men. I'm asking you one more time. Let go. Marcus's grip loosened slightly, but he didn't release her. Around them, the restaurant had gone deadly quiet. Servers had stopped moving. Other diners pretended to focus on their meals while stealing glances at the unfolding drama. You want to know about Amber? Marcus's voice was getting louder again, his control fraying with each word. Fine. Amber appreciates what I do. Amber doesn't question every decision I make. Amber doesn't make me feel like a criminal in my own life. Victoria felt the words like physical blows, but her legal training kicked in. Document everything. Remember details. Stay calm. So there is something to know about Amber. There's nothing. Marcus caught himself, realizing he'd confirmed what Victoria suspected. His face darkened further. You're twisting everything, making me sound like the bad guy. I'm not making you do anything. I'm listening to what you're saying. Marcus's phone buzzed again. And again. His free hand moved toward it instinctively, then stopped. The notification light blinked insistently. She's waiting for you to respond, Victoria observed. Shut up. The words were so sharp, so vicious, that several nearby diners audibly gasped. Victoria felt her baby move restlessly, as if sensing the tension surrounding them. I need to sit down, Victoria said. The baby, the baby, the baby, the baby. Marcus's voice rose to just under a shout. Everything is about the baby. What about me? What about what I need? Victoria stared at her husband, seeing him clearly for perhaps the first time. This was about his needs, his wants, his ego. The pregnancy, the marriage, even the baby growing inside her. It was all about Marcus Wellington and his narcissistic hunger for control. What you need is help, Victoria said quietly. That's when Marcus exploded. Help! His voice boomed across the restaurant now, causing every head to turn. I need help. I'm not the one making accusations. I'm not the one being paranoid and jealous. I'm not the one, sir. Grace Campbell, the restaurant manager, appeared beside their table with professional concern. Perhaps we could move this conversation somewhere more private. Marcus turned on her with fury that made the woman step back. Mind your own business. This is between my wife and me. Marcus, please, Victoria started. No. Marcus whirled back toward her, his movement sharp and aggressive. I'm tired of walking on eggshells. Tired of being treated like the enemy. Tired of your family thinking they're better than me. Sunak my family has nothing to do with. Your mother looks at me like I'm dirt. Your sister acts like I'm some kind of abuser. And now you... Marcus's voice cracked with self-pity and rage. Even my own wife thinks I'm a liar. You are lying, Victoria said simply. The truth hung in the air between them, undeniable and damning. Marcus's face went through a series of expressions: shock, denial, fury, and finally something cold and calculating. Maybe I am, he said quietly. Maybe I have to lie because the truth would hurt you. Victoria felt her heart breaking and hardening simultaneously. What truth? The truth is that you're not the woman I married. The truth is that pregnancy has made you needy and suspicious and impossible to live with. The truth is that Amber makes me feel like a man instead of a walking checkbook with a list of obligations. Each word was calculated to wound, delivered with surgical precision. Victoria absorbed them, cataloging the cruelty, the manipulation, the way he turned his betrayal into her fault. I see, she said quietly. Thank you for being honest. Victoria turned to leave, moving slowly with her pregnant bulk. She needed to get away from this man, this place, this scene that was destroying the last remnants of her marriage. But Marcus wasn't done. "Don't you walk away from me." He grabbed her wrist again, harder this time. "We're not finished." "Yes, we are." Victoria tried to pull free, but Marcus held on. Other diners were standing now, sensing danger. Grace Campbell was reaching for her phone. "Let go of her," a man at a nearby table shouted. Marcus ignored him, his grip tightening on Victoria's wrist. "You don't get to decide when we're finished. You don't get to control this." "I'm not trying to control anything. I just want to leave. To run to your mother, to make me look like the bad guy. I know how your family works." "Victoria, I know the game." Victoria looked into her husband's eyes and saw something that chilled her to the bone. This wasn't temporary anger or embarrassment. This was who Marcus Wellington really was when his carefully constructed facade cracked. This was the man she'd been living with, sleeping beside, planning a future with. "The only game here is the one you've been playing," Victoria said. "And I'm done playing." She pulled against his grip again, harder this time. Marcus held on, his fingers digging into her skin. Around them, other patrons were moving, some pulling out phones, others positioning themselves to intervene. "Please," Victoria said, looking directly into his eyes. "You're hurting me. You're hurting the baby." For just a moment, Marcus's expression flickered. Some vestige of the man she'd married seemed to surface, recognizing the horror of what he was doing. His grip loosened slightly. That's when Victoria pulled free. But Marcus, off balance and consumed with rage, lunged forward to grab her again. Victoria stumbled backward, her pregnant body ungainly and vulnerable. She reached out to steady herself, but her hand found only air. The edge of their table caught her in the lower back. Victoria's eyes widened in shock and pain as she felt herself falling. Time slowed as her hands moved instinctively to protect her belly, her body twisting as she tried to break her fall. She hit the floor hard, her hip and shoulder taking most of the impact. Pain shot through her body. But worse than the physical pain was the liquid she felt spreading beneath her. The restaurant fell into absolute silence. Victoria lay on the cold marble floor, one hand on her belly, one hand beneath her, feeling the warm wetness that could only mean one thing. "Oh God," she whispered. "Oh God. No." Marcus stood frozen above her, his face white with shock. Other diners rushed forward, but Victoria barely saw them. All she could focus on was the wetness spreading beneath her and the sudden, unmistakable tightening in her belly. "Call 911, Grace Campbell shouted, dropping to her knees beside Victoria. "Now!" Victoria looked up at her husband, the man who had just pushed his 8 months pregnant wife to the floor of an elegant restaurant, and spoke the words that would change everything. "Don't touch me. Don't come near me. Don't you dare touch me." Then the first contraction hit, 3 weeks early, and Victoria Sterling Wellington realized that her life as she'd known it was over. "My baby," Victoria whispered, her hand pressed against her belly as another contraction gripped her. "My baby, my baby." Grace Campbell knelt beside her, speaking in calm, professional tones that barely penetrated Victoria's shock. "The ambulance is coming. Try to breathe slowly, in and out. You're going to be okay." But Victoria wasn't okay. Her water had broken on the cold marble floor of Chez Laurent. 3 weeks before Emma was due, she could feel the contractions starting, irregular but unmistakable. Her daughter was coming whether the world was ready or not. Marcus stood frozen 3 feet away, his face cycling through expressions of shock, fear, and dawning realization of what he'd done. Other diners formed a protective semicircle around Victoria, blocking his view and access. "Is she okay?" someone called out. "Should we move her? Give her space to breathe." Grace Campbell, who had managed crises before, but never quite like this, directed the chaos with surprising calm. "Sir," she said to Marcus, "I need you to step back and let the professionals work." "She's my wife," Marcus said, his voice hollow. "That's my baby. The baby you just endangered." An elderly woman snapped from the growing crowd. "Stay away from her." Victoria heard the voices as if from underwater. Everything felt distant, unreal, like she was watching someone else's nightmare unfold. But the contractions were real. The wetness beneath her was real. The fear that she might lose her daughter was devastatingly real. "Don't let him near me," Victoria managed to say to Grace. "Please." Grace Campbell looked up at Marcus with professional steel in her eyes. "You need to wait outside, sir. Now." "I'm not leaving my wife. You just pushed your pregnant wife. You're leaving, or I'm calling security along with the paramedics." The restaurant's head of security, a former police officer named Tom, appeared as if summoned. He was a large, quiet man who'd broken up his share of disturbances, but never one involving a pregnant woman in premature labor. "Sir," Tom said to Marcus, his voice carrying the authority of experience, "you need to step outside." Marcus looked around the restaurant, seeing the faces of strangers all staring at him with disgust and horror. His perfect public image was crumbling in real time, and his narcissistic mind struggled to process being cast as the villain. "This is insane," Marcus muttered. "She fell. She's clumsy because she's pregnant." "I didn't. We all saw what happened," the elderly woman said sharply. "You grabbed her and pushed her. We all saw it." Victoria closed her eyes, concentrating on her breathing as another contraction built. Through the pain, she heard sirens approaching. Help was coming. Emma was going to be okay. She had to be okay. The paramedics burst through the restaurant's front doors with professional efficiency. 2 EMTs with a gurney and medical bags, moving with the practiced ease of people who'd seen every kind of emergency. "What do we have?" the lead EMT asked Grace. "Pregnant woman, approximately 8 months along. She was pushed and fell backward. Her water broke when she hit the floor. Contractions started about 5 minutes ago." Victoria opened her eyes to see a kind-faced woman in uniform kneeling beside her. "Hi there. I'm Sarah. We're going to take good care of you and your baby. Can you tell me your name?" "Victoria Sterling Wellington. I'm 32 weeks pregnant." "Actually 8 months, so closer to 36 weeks," Victoria corrected weakly. "Due date is September 15th. Sarah nodded, already checking Victoria's pulse and blood pressure. "Okay, Victoria, we're going to get you to the hospital. Are you having regular contractions? They just started, maybe every 4 or 5 minutes." "Good, that's manageable. We have time." Sarah looked up at her partner. "Let's get her loaded." As the EMTs prepared to move Victoria to the gurney, Marcus approached again. "I'm coming with her." "No," Victoria said firmly. "I don't want him in the ambulance." The EMTs exchanged glances. They'd seen domestic situations before, but usually not quite so public or dramatic. "Sir," Sarah said diplomatically, "why don't you meet us at the hospital? We need space to work. She's my wife. That's my child. And she's our patient," Sarah replied with finality. "She gets to decide who she wants with her right now." Victoria felt herself being lifted onto the gurney, the movement causing another contraction to spike through her body. She gripped Sarah's hand, fighting back tears. "Is my baby going to be okay?" "Your baby's going to be fine," Sarah assured her. 36 weeks is early but not dangerously so. We see healthy babies born at this stage all the time. As they wheeled Victoria toward the ambulance, she caught sight of Marcus standing in the restaurant's doorway. He looked lost, confused, as if he couldn't understand how his evening had gone so spectacularly wrong. For just a moment, Victoria felt a pang of the old sympathy that had kept her making excuses for him for months. Then another contraction hit, and she remembered why she was in an ambulance instead of celebrating their anniversary. "My sister," Victoria gasped as they loaded her into the ambulance. "I need to call my sister." Sarah helped her with her phone. "Rebecca. Vic, what's wrong? You sound—" "I'm in an ambulance. Marcus pushed me and my water broke. The baby's coming." The silence on the other end of the phone was deafening. "Then I'm on my way." "Which hospital?" "St. Mary's," Sarah called out. "St. Mary's," Victoria repeated. "Rebecca, can you call Mom?" "Already dialing." "Vic, are you okay? Are you hurt?" Victoria looked down at her body, cataloging the aches and pains. Her back and hip throbbed from the fall, but nothing felt broken or seriously injured. The baby was moving, which was good. The contractions were manageable, for now. "I'm okay. We're both okay. Just scared. I'll be there in 20 minutes. Less if I can manage it." Chirton. The ambulance pulled away from Chez Laurent, sirens wailing, carrying Victoria away from her marriage and toward an uncertain future. Through the small window, she could see Marcus standing on the sidewalk, his phone pressed to his ear, probably calling his lawyer. The thought should have made her sadder. Instead, it just made her tired. "Try to rest," Sarah advised. "We'll be at the hospital in 10 minutes, and then you'll have the best care available." Victoria closed her eyes and placed both hands on her belly. "Hang on, Emma," she whispered. "We're almost there. And when you get here, everything is going to be different. I promise." The ambulance raced through the city streets, carrying mother and daughter toward the moment that would change everything. Behind them, the wreckage of a marriage lay scattered across the marble floor of an expensive restaurant, witnessed by dozens of strangers who would never forget what they'd seen. In her purse, Victoria's phone buzzed with increasingly frantic messages from Marcus. She didn't read them. There would be time for lawyers and custody battles and the complex aftermath of abuse later. Right now, there was only Emma, fighting to enter a world that had just become infinitely more complicated, but also infinitely more honest. Judge Eleanor Sterling received the call while reviewing case files in her home study. 25 years on the bench had taught her to compartmentalize her emotions, to maintain judicial calm in the face of human drama and tragedy. But when she heard Rebecca's voice, tight with controlled panic, all her professional composure evaporated. "Mom, Victoria's in the hospital." Marcus pushed her and she went into premature labor. The words hit Eleanor like physical blows. She'd been a family court judge for over 2 decades, had seen every permutation of domestic violence, every excuse and justification abusers used to rationalize their actions. But hearing that her own daughter, her brilliant, strong, accomplished daughter, was a victim, made her hands shake with fury. "Which hospital?" "St. Mary's. I'm driving there now." "Mom, she's scared and alone and I'm leaving now." Eleanor hung up and sat for exactly 10 seconds, allowing herself that brief moment to feel the full weight of maternal rage and terror. Then she activated the cold judicial calm that had served her throughout her career, gathered her keys and purse, and drove toward the hospital with the controlled precision of someone accustomed to handling crises. During the 15-minute drive, her mind cataloged everything she knew about domestic violence patterns, legal precedents, and protective measures available under family law. But underneath the legal framework, a mother's fury burned white hot. Marcus Wellington was about to discover what happened when you hurt a judge's daughter. Eleanor arrived at St. Mary's to find Rebecca pacing in the maternity ward waiting area, her face streaked with tears and mascara. Rebecca was a social worker who dealt with family crises professionally, but seeing her own sister as a victim had shattered her usual composure. "How is she?" Eleanor asked, pulling Rebecca into a fierce hug. "In labor. They're monitoring the baby. She won't let Marcus in the room." Rebecca's voice cracked. "Mom, I should have seen this coming. The controlling behavior, the isolation, the way he made her doubt herself. I'm trained to recognize these patterns." "We all missed it," Eleanor said, though she wasn't entirely sure that was true. She'd had reservations about Marcus from the beginning, something calculating and cold behind his charming facade. But Victoria had seemed happy, and Eleanor had attributed her concerns to natural mother protectiveness. "Where is he now?" "Downstairs somewhere. He keeps calling her phone, sending flowers, trying to get the nurses to let him up. They're not buying his concerned husband act." Eleanor felt grim satisfaction. Hospital staff dealt with domestic violence regularly. They knew how to protect vulnerable patients. "I want to see Victoria." They found Victoria in a private labor room, hooked up to fetal monitors, her face pale but determined. She was breathing through contractions with the focused intensity of someone who'd taken childbirth classes seriously. "Mom," Victoria's voice broke when she saw Eleanor. "I'm sorry. I should have." "Stop." Eleanor moved to Victoria's bedside and took her daughter's hand. "You have nothing to apologize for. Nothing that happened tonight was your fault." Victoria's composure crumbled. "I defended him for months, made excuses, told myself his controlling behavior was just stress from work. I'm supposed to be smart about these things." "Abusers are masters of manipulation," Eleanor said firmly. "They isolate their victims gradually, erode their confidence systematically. The fact that you recognized what was happening and removed yourself from danger shows exactly how smart you are." Dr. Amanda Foster, Victoria's obstetrician, entered the room with a warm but professional smile. "How are we doing?" "Victoria. Contractions are about 3 minutes apart now, and they're getting stronger." "Doctor." Foster checked the monitors, her expression thoughtful. "Baby looks good. Heart rate is strong. At 36 weeks, we're looking at a healthy delivery, just a bit early." "Will she need special care?" Rebecca asked. "Probably a few days in the NICU for observation, but babies born at this stage typically do very well." Dr. Foster made notes in Victoria's chart. "Victoria, I understand there was an incident that precipitated this labor." Victoria glanced at her mother, then back at the doctor. "My husband pushed me during an argument. I fell backward and hit a table." Dr. Foster's expression remained carefully neutral, but Eleanor caught the tightening around her eyes. "I'll need to document any injuries as part of your medical record. Standard procedure in cases of domestic violence?" The clinical term hung in the air. Domestic violence, not marital problems or an argument that got out of hand. The legal and medical reality of what Marcus had done. "He's downstairs," Victoria said quietly, "trying to get up here." "Hospital security is aware of the situation," Dr. Foster assured her. "No one will be allowed in this room without your explicit consent." Eleanor squeezed Victoria's hand. "What do you need from me?" "I need Marcus to stay away from me. I need to know Emma will be safe. And I need," Victoria's voice broke, "I need to know that I can do this alone." "You're not alone," Rebecca said fiercely. "You have us. You have support. You have options. And you have legal protection," Eleanor added. "As soon as you're ready, we'll get a restraining order in place." Victoria nodded, then gasped as another contraction gripped her. Eleanor watched her daughter breathe through the pain with a combination of pride and heartbreak. Victoria was strong, stronger than she probably realized, but she shouldn't have to be. "Mom," Victoria said when the contraction passed, "I need you to know something. About tonight. About the way Marcus acted. I've never seen him like that before. The physical violence. But the emotional abuse, the control, the way he made me feel like I was going crazy, that's been building for months." Eleanor absorbed this information with the practiced calm of a judge hearing testimony, but inside, her fury continued to burn. "How long?" "Since I got pregnant, maybe before, but it got worse after. Like he saw the baby as competition for my attention, or maybe he just saw it as another way to control me." "That's a common pattern," Rebecca said gently. "Pregnancy often escalates abusive behavior because the victim becomes more vulnerable and dependent." Dr. Foster returned, checking Victoria's progress. "We're getting close, maybe another hour or two." As if summoned by the mention of timing, Victoria's phone rang. Marcus's name appeared on the screen. "Don't answer it," Eleanor advised. Victoria stared at the phone, then powered it off completely. "I can't deal with him right now. I need to focus on Emma." "Good choice," Dr. Foster said. "Stress can complicate labor. You need to focus on yourself and your baby." Over the next hour, Victoria's contractions intensified. Eleanor and Rebecca took turns holding her hands, offering ice chips, and providing the kind of unwavering support that Victoria had been missing for months. At 11:30 p.m., Dr. Foster announced that it was time to push. "Your daughter's ready to meet you," she said with a smile. Emma Rose Sterling Wellington entered the world at 11:47 p.m. on what should have been her parents' anniversary night. She weighed 5 pounds, 8 ounces, and her first cry was strong and indignant, as if protesting the circumstances of her early arrival. "She's beautiful," Eleanor whispered, tears streaming down her face as she watched her granddaughter being placed on Victoria's chest. Victoria stared down at her daughter with wonder and fierce protectiveness. Emma had dark hair like Marcus, but Victoria's delicate features. She was tiny but perfect, her fingers grasping at air, her eyes squinting against the bright hospital lights. "Hello, baby girl," Victoria whispered. "I'm your mama, and I'm going to keep you safe. I promise." As Dr. Foster and the nurses completed their post-delivery procedures, Eleanor stepped into the hallway to make a phone call. She needed to set certain wheels in motion before Marcus realized that his access to his wife and daughter was about to be legally restricted. But first, she allowed herself one moment of pure grandmother joy. Emma was healthy, Victoria was strong, and Marcus Wellington was about to learn that terrorizing a judge's family came with consequences he couldn't buy or charm his way out of. Eleanor pulled out her phone and dialed Detective Paul Morrison, a longtime family friend who specialized in domestic violence cases. "Paul, it's Eleanor Sterling. I need your help. My daughter was assaulted tonight by her husband, and I want him arrested." Detective Paul Morrison had known Victoria Sterling since she was 8 years old, when Eleanor had been a newly appointed family court judge and Paul was a rookie beat cop. He'd watched Victoria grow into a formidable prosecutor, had attended her wedding to Marcus Wellington, and had bounced baby Emma on his knee at christenings and holidays, which made driving to St. Mary's Hospital at 3 in the morning to arrest Victoria's husband one of the most difficult calls of his 20-year career. Paul was a large, gentle man who'd chosen law enforcement to protect people like Victoria, intelligent, accomplished women who somehow found themselves trapped in abusive relationships despite all their education and professional success. He'd seen it too many times to be surprised, but it never stopped being heartbreaking. Marcus was in the hospital lobby when Paul arrived, pacing and making increasingly agitated phone calls to someone who was probably his lawyer. He changed from his expensive dinner clothes into a rumpled polo shirt and khakis, looking more like a worried husband than the millionaire tech executive whose company photos graced magazine covers. But Paul had learned to read body language, and Marcus's posture screamed guilt and desperation rather than genuine concern. "Marcus Wellington." Paul approached with professional calm. Marcus looked up, his face cycling through confusion, recognition, and calculation. "Detective Morrison, what are you doing here? I need to speak with you about the incident at Chez Laurent tonight." "Incident?" Marcus's voice climbed higher. "There was no incident. My wife fell. She's clumsy because she's pregnant. I've been trying to see her for hours, but the hospital won't." "Sir, I'm going to need you to come with me for questioning." Marcus stared at Paul as if he'd spoken a foreign language. In Marcus's world, wealthy men didn't get arrested for domestic disturbances. They made donations to police benevolent associations, engulfed with judges, and had their lawyers handle any unpleasantness. "I'm not going anywhere. My wife just had a baby. I need to—" "Mr. Wellington, you're under arrest for domestic assault and endangering an unborn child." Paul began reading Miranda rights as Marcus's face went through a spectacular range of expressions: shock, outrage, disbelief, and finally a kind of petulant fury that Paul had seen in other privileged men who'd never faced real consequences. "This is insane," Marcus sputtered. "I didn't assault anyone. Victoria's being dramatic because of pregnancy hormones. You know how women get when they're—" "You have the right to remain silent," Paul continued steadily. "I suggest you use it." But Marcus couldn't remain silent. He talked throughout the entire arrest process, alternating between indignation, self-pity, and attempts at charm. He mentioned his company's community contributions, his charity work, his status as a pillar of the business community. Paul documented it all, recognizing the classic narcissistic response to accountability. Marcus genuinely seemed to believe that his wealth and status should protect him from the consequences of pushing his pregnant wife. The booking process at the county jail was a revelation for Marcus. Strip searches, fingerprinting, mugshots, all the indignities that regular people faced when they committed crimes. His expensive clothes were replaced with Orange County jail scrubs, and his perfectly styled hair became disheveled and unwashed. "I want my lawyer," Marcus demanded for the 15th time. "Your lawyer has been notified," Paul replied patiently. "He'll meet you in the morning for arraignment." "Arraignment? I'm not staying here overnight." But Marcus was staying overnight, along with drunk drivers, drug dealers, and other men who'd committed crimes of violence. He spent his first night as a defendant, curled up on a narrow jail bunk, listening to his cellmates snore and trying to process how his perfect life had imploded in less than 12 hours. Meanwhile, at the hospital, Victoria was learning to breastfeed while Rebecca helped her document every detail of Marcus's escalating behavior over the past months. They created a timeline of control, isolation, and emotional abuse that would become crucial evidence in the legal proceedings to come. "He took away my credit cards last month," Victoria remembered. "Said he wanted to streamline our finances, but really he wanted to control every dollar I spent." "Classic financial abuse," Rebecca noted, writing everything down. "What else?" "He monitored my phone calls, especially with you and Mom. Said I was gossiping about our marriage instead of working on our problems." Isolation tactics. He was cutting you off from your support system. Victoria looked down at Emma, sleeping peacefully in her arms despite being born 3 weeks early. The NICU doctors had declared her remarkably healthy, with strong lungs and good reflexes. She'd only need a few days of monitoring before going home. Home. Victoria realized she wasn't sure where home was anymore. The house was in Marcus's name, filled with his things, designed around his preferences. She'd given up her apartment when they married, sold most of her furniture, merged her life so completely into his that she'd lost track of where Victoria ended and Mrs. Wellington began. "Where am I going to live?" Victoria asked suddenly. Eleanor looked up from the legal documents she'd been reviewing. "With me, for as long as you need. Your childhood room is exactly as you left it." "Mom, I'm 32 years old with a newborn baby. And you're my daughter who needs support right now. There's no shame in accepting help." Dr. Foster entered with Emma's latest test results. "Everything looks perfect. She's a strong little girl. We'll probably discharge you both tomorrow afternoon." "Say, what about Marcus? Will he be able to?" "I filed for an emergency protective order," Eleanor said firmly. "He won't be allowed within 500 feet of you or Emma." Victoria felt a complex mix of relief and grief. She dreamed of bringing her first child home to a loving family, not fleeing from an abusive husband with a restraining order and a police escort. "I keep thinking about the woman I used to be," Victoria said quietly. "The prosecutor who sent men like Marcus to jail. How did I become the victim?" "You didn't become anything," Rebecca said fiercely. "You survived. You recognized danger and removed yourself and Emma from it. That takes incredible strength." Eleanor's phone rang. Paul Morrison's name appeared on the screen. "He's been arrested and booked," Paul reported. "Spent the night in county lockup. His lawyer will probably get him out on bail this morning, but the charges are serious. With the restaurant witnesses and Victoria's injuries, we have a solid case." "What are the specific charges?" "Domestic assault, child endangerment, and I'm adding stalking based on the harassment you've documented. If he violates the protective order, he goes right back to jail." Victoria felt something she hadn't experienced in months: safety. Marcus's money and connections couldn't buy his way out of this situation. The system was finally working to protect her instead of enabling her abuser. Emma stirred in her arms, making tiny mewling sounds that might become cries if not addressed quickly. Victoria adjusted her position, offering her breast, watching in wonder as her daughter latched on with determined hunger. "She knows what she wants," Rebecca observed with a smile. "She gets that from her mother," Eleanor said proudly. Victoria looked down at her daughter and felt something shift inside her, a fierce protectiveness that was both tender and ferocious. Emma would grow up knowing that her mother had chosen safety over social expectations, courage over convenience, truth over the comfortable lies that had nearly destroyed them both. "I'm going to be okay," Victoria said, more to herself than anyone else. "We're going to be okay." Marcus Wellington's first taste of genuine consequences came at 8 a.m. when his high-powered attorney, James Bradford, met him in the county jail's attorney consultation room. Bradford was everything Marcus had paid for: expensive suit, Harvard law degree, connections throughout the legal system, but even he couldn't mask his concern about the charges his client faced. "This is bad, Marcus," Bradford said without preamble. "Domestic assault with witnesses, child endangerment, now stalking charges. The optics are terrible." Marcus, still wearing orange jail scrubs and sporting a night's worth of stubble, looked nothing like the polished executive who'd graced business magazine covers. "It's all blown out of proportion. Victoria fell because she's clumsy. Pregnant women lose their balance." Bradford consulted his notes with the weary expression of a lawyer who'd heard every excuse. 17 witnesses saw you grab her wrist and push her. Restaurant security cameras recorded the entire incident. The manager gave a statement describing your aggressive behavior throughout the evening. They're all lying. Marcus, listen to me carefully. Stop talking about what happened and start thinking about damage control. Your company's board is meeting this morning to discuss your conduct. Your investors are asking questions. This isn't going away." The reality of his situation was finally penetrating Marcus's narcissistic fog. His perfect life, the successful company, the society marriage, the carefully crafted public image was crumbling because he couldn't control his temper for one evening. What about custody of my daughter? Your daughter, Bradford raised an eyebrow. The child you endangered by assaulting her mother, Marcus? You're looking at supervised visitation at best, assuming you avoid jail time. Marcus stared at his lawyer with genuine confusion. In his mind, he was still the victim of a vindictive wife and her powerful family. The possibility that his actions had consequences beyond temporary inconvenience simply didn't compute. Bradford posted bail 2 hours later, and Marcus emerged from county jail to find a small crowd of reporters waiting. Someone had leaked the story to the media, and tech millionaire arrested for domestic violence was exactly the kind of scandal that sold papers and generated clicks. Mr. Wellington, do you have any comment about the charges against you? Did you really push your pregnant wife? What's your response to the abuse allegations? Marcus, still thinking like a CEO managing a PR crisis rather than a defendant facing serious criminal charges, decided to take control of the narrative. My wife is going through a difficult pregnancy, Marcus told the reporters, his voice carrying the confident authority he'd used in countless board meetings. She's been emotional, unstable, making accusations that have no basis in reality. I'm the victim here of a vindictive family that's using their legal connections to destroy me. Bradford watched his client's impromptu press conference with horror. Every word was being recorded. Every statement would be used against him in court. The Sterling family thinks they're above the law, Marcus continued, warming to his theme. Judge Eleanor Sterling is corrupt, using her position to persecute me because she never approved of her daughter's marriage to someone from outside her elite circle. The reporters scribbled furiously, recognizing a story that was getting better by the minute. Not only was Marcus providing them with quotable outrage, he was attacking a respected judge who'd spent 25 years building an impeccable reputation. Marcus, Bradford hissed, trying to pull his client away from the microphones. Stop talking, now! But Marcus couldn't stop. For months, he'd been building resentment against Victoria's family, feeling diminished by their accomplishments and genuine respect in the community. His narcissistic injury demanded retaliation. Eleanor Sterling raised daughters who think they're better than everyone else, Marcus declared. Victoria was manipulative from the beginning, trapping me with pregnancy and then using her family's legal connections when I tried to stand up for myself. The press conference was a disaster of epic proportions, and it was broadcast live on local news, posted on social media, and picked up by national outlets within hours. Marcus's attempt to control the narrative had instead provided devastating evidence of his character and mindset. At St. Mary's Hospital, Victoria watched her husband's press conference on her phone while Emma slept in her arms. Each word felt like another nail in the coffin of their marriage, but also strangely liberating. Marcus was showing the world exactly who he really was, removing any doubt about Victoria's decision to leave. He's making our case for us, Eleanor observed, watching over Victoria's shoulder. No judge or jury will have any sympathy for him after this performance. Rebecca shook her head in amazement. He actually believes what he's saying. He genuinely thinks he's the victim. Classic narcissistic personality disorder, Dr. Foster said, entering the room for Emma's final checkup before discharge. I see it sometimes in domestic violence cases. The abuser cannot accept responsibility, so reality becomes whatever serves their narrative. Victoria felt a complex mix of emotions watching Marcus destroy himself on live television. Part of her still mourned the man she'd thought she married, but mostly she felt relief that Emma would grow up with a documented record of exactly what kind of man her father really was. Are you ready to go home? Eleanor asked. Victoria looked around the hospital room that had been her sanctuary for the past 2 days. Home meant facing the legal battles ahead, the custody negotiations, the process of rebuilding her life as a single mother. It meant accepting that her marriage was truly over, and that she'd have to co-parent with a man who'd shown himself capable of violence. But it also meant freedom from constant manipulation, relief from walking on eggshells, and the opportunity to raise her daughter in an environment of honesty and genuine love. I'm ready, Victoria said, gathering Emma closer. Let's go home. As they prepared to leave the hospital, Victoria's phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. You think you've won, but this isn't over. I know where you live. Victoria showed the message to Detective Morrison, who'd arrived to escort them safely out of the hospital. That's a violation of the restraining order, Paul said grimly. We'll trace the number and add it to the charges. Victoria realized that Marcus's public breakdown hadn't ended his harassment, it had escalated it. But she also realized that she wasn't afraid anymore. She had legal protection, family support, and most importantly, she had the clarity that came from seeing her abuser's true nature without the fog of manipulation and self-doubt. Emma stirred in her carrier, blinking up at her mother with dark, serious eyes that seemed to take in everything around her. Victoria touched her daughter's tiny hand, feeling the strength that came from knowing she'd chosen safety over convenience, truth over comfortable lies. Let's go face whatever comes next. Baby girl, Victoria whispered. Together. District Attorney Sarah Campbell had been Eleanor Sterling's roommate at law school 30 years ago, but their friendship extended far beyond shared academic memories. Sarah had built her career prosecuting violent crimes, with a particular focus on domestic violence cases that often fell through the cracks of an overburdened legal system. When Eleanor called asking Sarah to personally handle Marcus Wellington's case, the request came with unspoken weight. Not because Eleanor was seeking favorable treatment, but because she knew Sarah would ensure that wealth and connections didn't shield an abuser from consequences. He's hired James Bradford, Eleanor informed Sarah during their private meeting in the DA's office, and he's already started a media campaign claiming judicial bias and family conspiracy. Sarah reviewed the case file with the thorough attention that had made her one of the state's most respected prosecutors. Restaurant security footage, witness statements, hospital records, evidence of escalating harassment. It was stronger than most domestic violence cases that crossed her desk. Bradford will try every delay tactic in the book, Sarah predicted. He'll file motions to dismiss, claim police misconduct, argue that the charges are politically motivated. Standard playbook for wealthy defendants. What's our timeline? Arraignment is tomorrow. I'll push for remand without bail based on the stalking behavior and threats. Bradford will argue that Wellington is a pillar of the community with no flight risk. Eleanor nodded grimly. Marcus has passport, private jet access, and business interests in countries without extradition treaties. He's exactly the kind of defendant who might flee. Sarah made notes in the file. I'll argue that point strongly. How is Victoria holding up? Better than expected. Stronger than I think she realizes. But the harassment is continuing despite the restraining order. That harassment had indeed escalated since Marcus's disastrous press conference. Victoria's phone received a constant stream of threatening messages from numbers that were traced and blocked, only to be replaced by new ones. Expensive gifts arrived at Eleanor's house, daily flowers, jewelry, baby clothes, each accompanied by notes that alternated between desperate apologies and subtle threats. I'll handle this personally, Sarah promised. Wellington needs to understand that attacking your family was the worst strategic mistake he could have made. Meanwhile, Bradford was implementing his defense strategy with the ruthless efficiency that made him one of the state's most expensive criminal attorneys. His first move was to file a motion claiming that Judge Sterling had prejudiced the case through her public statements and family connections. The motion was assigned to Judge Patricia Hensley, a colleague of Eleanor's with 20 years of experience in criminal law. Bradford's argument was sophisticated. He claimed that Eleanor's involvement in Victoria's case created an appearance of impropriety that tainted the entire prosecution. Judge Hensley reviewed the motion during a closed hearing, with Bradford presenting his case for dismissal based on alleged prosecutorial misconduct and judicial bias. Your Honor, Bradford argued, Judge Sterling has used her position to ensure that my client faces enhanced charges and media scrutiny that wouldn't apply to ordinary defendants. The prosecution has been compromised by personal vendettas. Sarah Campbell stood to respond, her voice carrying the authority of 3 decades in courtrooms. Your Honor, Mr. Bradford's motion is nothing more than victim blaming, disguised as legal procedure. Judge Sterling has acted appropriately as both a judge and a mother. The evidence against Mr. Wellington stands on its own merits. Judge Hensley had reviewed every piece of evidence, every witness statement, every threatening message. The case against Marcus was overwhelming, regardless of family connections. Motion denied, Judge Hensley ruled. The charges against Mr. Wellington are supported by substantial evidence and multiple independent witnesses. This court will not dismiss valid charges simply because the victim has family members in the legal profession. Bradford's second strategy was to attack Victoria's credibility through private investigators and character assassination. He hired a firm that specialized in finding dirt on prosecution witnesses, looking for anything that might undermine Victoria's reputation or suggest she had fabricated the abuse allegations. The investigators found nothing. Victoria's professional record was impeccable, her personal life boringly respectable. Former colleagues described her as ethical, intelligent, and dedicated. Even her law school professors remembered her as exceptional. Frustrated by the lack of character flaws to exploit, Bradford turned to a more direct approach, psychological warfare designed to break Victoria's resolve. The harassment campaign intensified. Victoria received dozens of packages daily, ostensibly gifts from Marcus, but clearly intended to demonstrate that he could reach her anywhere, anytime. Each delivery was documented by police, each violation of the restraining order adding to the mounting charges. But the psychological impact was undeniable. "He's trying to wear me down," Victoria told Rebecca during one particularly difficult day. "Make me so exhausted that I'll drop the charges just to make it stop." "Is it working?" Rebecca asked gently. Victoria looked down at Emma, sleeping peacefully in her bouncer, oblivious to the legal warfare surrounding her birth. "No, it's making me more determined." The most dangerous escalation came when Marcus began showing up at places Victoria frequented: the grocery store, Emma's pediatrician's office, the coffee shop near Eleanor's house. He maintained the legal fiction of coincidence, claiming he just happened to be in the neighborhood, but his presence was clearly calculated intimidation. Detective Morrison increased patrols around Eleanor's house and assigned an officer to accompany Victoria on necessary errands. The protection was reassuring, but also a constant reminder that Marcus's wealth hadn't eliminated his capacity for violence. It had simply made him more sophisticated about expressing it. "He's escalating because he's losing control," Paul Morrison explained during a security briefing at Eleanor's house. "Rich guys like Wellington don't handle consequences well. When the usual fixes don't work, lawyers, PR campaigns, character assassination, they get desperate." Eleanor had seen the pattern in family court countless times. Wealthy abusers who couldn't buy their way out of accountability often became more dangerous, not less. "What are our options for enhanced protection?" Eleanor asked. "I can request additional patrol units, maybe a safe house if the threats become more specific. But honestly, the best protection is getting this guy convicted and locked up." The preliminary hearing was scheduled for the following week, and Bradford was preparing his most aggressive defense yet. He planned to argue that Victoria had staged the entire incident, using her legal knowledge and family connections to frame an innocent man. It was a desperate strategy, but desperation was all Bradford had left. The evidence against Marcus was overwhelming, the witnesses were credible, and the defendant's own behavior had eliminated any sympathy a jury might have felt for a successful businessman facing criminal charges. Victoria spent the days before the hearing preparing her testimony with Sarah Campbell, reviewing every detail of that night at Chez Laurent and the months of abuse that preceded it. "Bradford will try to rattle you," Sarah warned. "He'll suggest you're vindictive, manipulative, using your daughter as a weapon against your husband. Remember that he's performing for the judge and potential jury. Stay calm, stick to the facts, and let the evidence speak for itself." Victoria nodded, feeling more confident than she had in months. Marcus had shown the world exactly who he was through his own actions and words. Now it was time for the legal system to respond accordingly. Emma gurgled from her carrier, as if offering encouragement. Victoria smiled down at her daughter, remembering the promise she'd made in the hospital to keep Emma safe, no matter what it cost. The preliminary hearing would determine whether Marcus faced trial for his crimes, but Victoria had already won the most important victory: her freedom from an abusive marriage and the knowledge that she'd chosen courage over convenience, truth over comfortable lies. Now it was time to let justice follow its course. The courtroom was packed beyond capacity for what should have been a routine preliminary hearing. Marcus Wellington's case had captured public attention in ways that made court officials nervous. Domestic violence cases rarely drew media scrutiny, but the combination of wealth, judicial family connections, and Marcus's own inflammatory statements had turned it into a spectacle. Judge Patricia Hensley surveyed the crowd with the stern authority that had maintained order in her courtroom for 2 decades. She recognized reporters, legal colleagues, and curious members of the public who'd been following the story through social media and local news coverage. "This is a court of law, not a theater," Judge Hensley announced. "Anyone who disrupts these proceedings will be removed immediately." Marcus sat at the defendant's table beside James Bradford, looking every inch the successful businessman despite the circumstances. His expensive suit was perfectly tailored, his hair styled with professional precision, but Victoria noticed the tension in his shoulders, the way his hands trembled slightly when he thought no one was watching. Victoria sat in the witness section with Eleanor and Rebecca, Emma sleeping peacefully in her carrier despite the formal atmosphere. Several photographers had tried to get pictures of the baby, but court security had blocked them effectively. Sarah Campbell stood to present the prosecution's case, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd fought for domestic violence victims throughout her career. "Your Honor, the evidence will show that Marcus Wellington committed assault against his pregnant wife during a violent altercation at Chez Laurent restaurant. 17 witnesses observed the defendant grab Mrs. Wellington's wrist and push her backward, causing her to fall and go into premature labor. Sarah methodically presented the evidence security camera footage, witness statements, medical records documenting Victoria's injuries, and a timeline of escalating harassment following Marcus's arrest." Bradford rose to respond, his strategy immediately clear. "Your Honor, my client is the victim of a vindictive prosecution orchestrated by the Sterling family. Judge Eleanor Sterling has used her influence to ensure that a private marital disagreement has been blown into criminal charges." The accusation hung in the air like smoke. Bradford was essentially arguing that the entire case was a judicial conspiracy, that Eleanor had corrupted the legal process to persecute her son-in-law. Judge Hensley's expression remained neutral, but Victoria saw the slight tightening around her eyes. Attacking a respected colleague was a dangerous strategy, one that could backfire spectacularly. "The defense will show that Mrs. Wellington is manipulative and vindictive," Bradford continued, "using her legal knowledge and family connections to destroy my client's reputation and business interests." Victoria felt the familiar surge of self-doubt that had plagued her throughout her marriage. Marcus's lawyer was using the same tactics Marcus had employed, making her question her own perceptions, suggesting that her response to abuse was somehow worse than the abuse itself. But then she looked down at Emma, remembering the moment her daughter was born 3 weeks early because her father had pushed her mother to the floor of a restaurant. The physical evidence of Marcus's violence was literally sleeping in her arms. Sarah Campbell called her first witness, Grace Campbell, the restaurant manager who'd knelt beside Victoria on the marble floor. "I saw the defendant grab Mrs. Wellington's wrist," Grace testified. "She tried to pull away, but he held on. Then he pushed her backward. She fell and hit the table before going to the ground." Bradford's cross-examination was aggressive but ineffective. Grace had managed crisis situations before and wasn't intimidated by expensive lawyers or implications that she was lying. "Ma'am, isn't it possible that Mrs. Wellington simply lost her balance? Pregnant women are notoriously clumsy." Grace's response was sharp and immediate. "Sir, I watched a man push his pregnant wife to the ground. I know what I saw." Witness after witness corroborated Grace's account. The elderly woman who'd called Marcus despicable, the businessman who'd offered to intervene, the young couple who'd recorded part of the incident on their phone. Bradford's attempts to discredit their testimony fell flat. These weren't friends of the Sterling family or people with axes to grind. They were ordinary citizens who'd witnessed domestic violence and were brave enough to speak up about it. The most damaging testimony came from Detective Morrison, who described Marcus's behavior during and after his arrest. "The defendant showed no remorse or concern for his wife's condition," Paul testified. "His primary focus was on managing his public image and avoiding consequences for his actions." Bradford objected repeatedly, arguing that his client's statements were being taken out of context. But the judge overruled each objection, allowing the jury to hear exactly what kind of man Marcus Wellington was when his carefully constructed facade cracked. When Sarah Campbell finished presenting the prosecution's case, Judge Hensley called a brief recess. The evidence was overwhelming video footage, multiple witnesses, medical records, and a pattern of escalating harassment that demonstrated ongoing danger to Victoria and Emma. Bradford's defense was limited to character assassination and conspiracy theories that grew less credible with each witness. During the recess, Marcus made a decision that would seal his fate. Against his lawyer's strong advice, he decided to testify on his own behalf. I can explain what really happened, Marcus told Bradford. These people are lying about me. I need to set the record straight. Bradford knew it was a mistake. Marcus's narcissistic personality made him incapable of accepting responsibility, and his sense of entitlement would come across clearly to any jury. But he couldn't prevent his client from testifying if Marcus insisted. When court resumed, Bradford announced that the defense would call Marcus Wellington to the stand. Victoria watched her husband take the oath to tell the truth, wondering if he was even capable of recognizing truth anymore. His reality had become so distorted by narcissism and self-interest that he genuinely seemed to believe his own lies. Bradford's direct examination was carefully scripted, designed to present Marcus as a loving husband concerned about his wife's mental health during a difficult pregnancy. "Did you push your wife, Mr. Wellington?" "Absolutely not. Victoria lost her balance because she was upset and pregnancy had made her clumsy. I tried to steady her, but she fell anyway." "Why do you think witnesses claim they saw you push her?" "The Sterling family has a lot of influence in this city. People see what they think they're supposed to see." It was a polished performance, delivered with the confident authority that had made Marcus successful in business. But Victoria could see the underlying arrogance that had made her life miserable for months. Then Sarah Campbell rose for cross-examination, and Marcus's careful facade began to crumble. "Mr. Wellington, you testified that you were trying to steady your wife when she fell. But security footage shows you grabbing her wrist and pulling her toward you before pushing her away. How do you explain that?" Marcus's composure flickered slightly. "The footage is unclear. People are interpreting normal gestures as aggressive behavior. 17 people interpreted your normal gestures as assault. Are they all wrong? They're all influenced by my wife's family's reputation." Sarah moved to more dangerous territory. "Mr. Wellington, since your arrest, you've sent your wife hundreds of threatening messages despite a restraining order. You've appeared at locations she frequents. You've sent unwanted gifts to her home. Do you consider this normal behavior?" Bradford objected, but Judge Hensley overruled him. The harassment was directly relevant to Marcus's character and the danger he posed to Victoria and Emma. "I've been trying to communicate with my wife about our marriage and our daughter," Marcus replied. "A man has a right to contact his family, even when that contact is legally prohibited and causes fear." Marcus's mask slipped completely. "Victoria is using legal technicalities to keep me from my daughter. She's vindictive and manipulative, and she's being enabled by her corrupt family." The courtroom fell silent. Marcus had just demonstrated exactly the kind of thinking that made him dangerous, the belief that his wants trumped everyone else's rights, including legal protections for domestic violence victims. Sarah pressed her advantage. "Mr. Wellington, do you take any responsibility for the events at Chez Laurent restaurant?" "I take responsibility for marrying a woman who's used pregnancy and her family's influence to destroy my life," Marcus replied with barely controlled fury. Bradford was making frantic gestures, trying to signal his client to stop talking, but Marcus was beyond controlling. Months of resentment and narcissistic injury were pouring out in open court. "Do you believe you've done anything wrong in your marriage?" "I've been too patient with Victoria's manipulation, too understanding about her family's interference, too willing to excuse behavior that would be unacceptable from anyone else." Victoria listened to her husband's testimony with a mixture of sadness and relief. This was who Marcus really was, a man incapable of accountability, empathy, or genuine remorse. She'd made the right choice in leaving him, regardless of the personal cost. When Sarah Campbell finished her cross-examination, Marcus had effectively convicted himself through his own words. The jury would hear not just the facts of what happened at Chez Laurent, but the mindset that made such violence inevitable. Judge Hensley reviewed the evidence and testimony with the thorough attention that complex cases demanded. The prosecution had presented overwhelming proof of guilt. The defense had offered nothing but conspiracy theories and victim blaming. "Based on the evidence presented," Judge Hensley announced, "this court finds sufficient probable cause to bind the defendant over for trial on all charges." Marcus's face went white. He genuinely believed that his wealth, his lawyers, and his ability to charm people would protect him from consequences. The reality of facing a criminal trial was finally penetrating his narcissistic delusions. Bradford requested bail pending trial, Arguing that Marcus was a respected businessman with strong community ties, Sarah Campbell stood to oppose bail with every tool at her disposal. Your Honor, the defendant has violated restraining orders, engaged in stalking behavior, and shown no remorse for endangering his wife and unborn child. He poses an ongoing danger to the victims and has the resources to flee prosecution. Judge Hensley considered both arguments carefully. Marcus Wellington had money, connections, and demonstrated willingness to ignore court orders. The combination made him exactly the kind of defendant who might disappear rather than face trial. Bail is denied, Judge Hensley ruled. The defendant will be held pending trial. The gavel fell with finality that echoed through the packed courtroom. Marcus stared in shock as bailiffs approached to take him into custody. His perfect life of wealth and privilege had just collided with the reality of justice, and justice was winning. Victoria felt Emma stir in her carrier, as if sensing the change in atmosphere. She looked down at her daughter and whispered, "It's going to be okay. Baby girl, justice is coming." The trial of Marcus Wellington began 3 months later, in late winter when the trees outside the courthouse were bare and the air carried the promise of snow. Victoria had spent those months learning to be a single mother while preparing for the legal battle that would determine Marcus's fate and, by extension, Emma's future. Emma had thrived despite the circumstances of her birth. At 5 months old, she was a plump, happy baby with dark hair and her mother's determined chin. She'd adapted to life with her grandmother and aunt, surrounded by love and stability that she'd never known in her father's volatile presence. Victoria had changed too. The frightened, manipulated woman who'd left Chez Laurent in an ambulance had been replaced by someone stronger and clearer about her own worth. She'd started seeing a therapist who specialized in domestic violence recovery, joined a support group for abuse survivors, and begun the slow process of rebuilding her sense of self. The courthouse was even more crowded for the trial than it had been for the preliminary hearing. Marcus's case had become a symbol of broader issues: domestic violence, wealth inequality, the justice system's treatment of privileged defendants. Media trucks lined the street outside, and court security had been increased to manage the attention. Marcus looked different after 3 months in county jail. His expensive suits had been replaced by a rumpled court-appointed attorney's jacket. His perfectly styled hair was unkempt. His face had lost the smooth confidence that wealth and privilege had maintained. Jail had been a harsh education for a man who'd never faced real consequences before. James Bradford had withdrawn from the case 6 weeks earlier, citing irreconcilable differences with the client. The translation was simple. Marcus had run out of money to pay expensive lawyers. His company's board had fired him after the preliminary hearing. His assets were frozen pending civil litigation from defrauded investors. And the IRS was investigating his business practices. His replacement was Karen Mills, a competent public defender who specialized in hopeless cases. She'd reviewed the evidence with professional thoroughness and advised Marcus to plead guilty in exchange for reduced charges. He'd refused, still believing that he could charm a jury into seeing him as the victim. Sarah Campbell opened the trial with devastating clarity. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, this case is about power and control, about a man who believed his wealth and status gave him the right to hurt his pregnant wife when she refused to submit to his authority. Sarah methodically presented the evidence: restaurant security footage, witness testimony, medical records, and the pattern of harassment that continued even after Marcus's arrest. Each piece of evidence built upon the others, creating an overwhelming picture of guilt. The most powerful testimony came from Victoria herself. She wore a simple navy dress that conveyed professional competence while emphasizing her role as a mother. Emma sat in the gallery with Rebecca, occasionally making baby sounds that reminded everyone exactly what Marcus had endangered with his violence. "He grabbed my wrist when I tried to leave," Victoria testified, her voice steady despite the emotional weight of reliving that night. "When I pulled away, he pushed me backward. I fell and hit the table, then went to the ground." Karen Mills conducted a respectful cross-examination, but there was little she could do to undermine Victoria's credibility. Victoria answered each question calmly and honestly, without the defensiveness or anger that might have suggested vindictiveness. "Mrs. Wellington, isn't it true that your marriage was troubled long before the incident at the restaurant?" "Yes, that's true. My husband had become increasingly controlling and emotionally abusive over several months. And you never sought help for these marital problems. I was told repeatedly that the problems were my fault, that pregnancy was making me irrational, that I was being too sensitive. When you're told often enough that your perceptions are wrong, you start to doubt yourself. Mills tried different approaches, but each one only reinforced Victoria's credibility and the systematic nature of Marcus's abuse. The jury could see for themselves the kind of manipulation that had trapped Victoria in an abusive marriage. The most damaging moment for the defense came when Mills made the strategic error of calling Marcus to testify in his own defense. Marcus had spent 3 months in jail nursing his resentments and refining his sense of victimhood. He took the stand with the same arrogant confidence that had served him in boardrooms, apparently believing he could manipulate a jury as easily as he'd manipulated business associates. "I loved my wife," Marcus testified, his voice carrying practiced sincerity. "Everything I did was to provide for our family, to give our daughter the best possible life." Mills guided him through a carefully rehearsed account of their marriage, presenting Marcus as a devoted husband frustrated by Victoria's increasingly erratic behavior during pregnancy. But Sarah Campbell's cross-examination revealed the real Marcus Wellington, the narcissistic abuser, who genuinely believed he was entitled to control his wife through whatever means necessary. "Mr. Wellington, you testified that you loved your wife. Is that why you monitored her phone calls and controlled her access to money?" "I was trying to protect our family's privacy and financial security. By isolating her from her support system and making her dependent on your approval for basic needs." Marcus's composure began to crack. Victoria was making poor decisions. Someone had to be responsible. Someone had to control her. "You mean, I was being a husband?" The outburst echoed through the courtroom. Marcus caught himself immediately, but the damage was done. The jury had seen the anger that lurked beneath his polished surface. Sarah pressed harder. "Mr. Wellington, on the night in question, did you grab your wife's wrist to prevent her from leaving?" "I was trying to calm her down. By physically restraining her against her will, she was being hysterical." "So you decided physical force was appropriate?" Marcus stared at Sarah with barely contained fury. 3 months of jail, public humiliation, and financial ruin had stripped away his ability to maintain the charming facade that had fooled people for years. "Victoria was out of control," Marcus said, his voice rising. "She was making a scene, embarrassing me in front of important people. Someone had to stop her. Stop her from doing what? Asking questions about your affair." "There was no affair." "But there was someone named Amber sending you intimate messages during your anniversary dinner." Marcus went silent, realizing he'd walked into a trap. His affair with Amber Chen, his company's marketing director, had been thoroughly documented during the investigation. Text messages, hotel receipts, witnesses who'd seen them together, the evidence was overwhelming. "Mr. Wellington, when your 8 months pregnant wife discovered your affair and tried to leave the restaurant, you physically prevented her departure and then pushed her to the ground. Is that correct?" "She fell because she was clumsy. 17 witnesses saw you push her. They were all lying. Why would 17 strangers lie about what they witnessed?" Marcus's narcissistic rage finally exploded completely. Because her corrupt judge mother paid them to lie, because the whole system is rigged against successful men who refuse to be controlled by manipulative women. The courtroom erupted in shocked murmurs. Marcus had just accused Eleanor Sterling of bribing witnesses and corrupting the judicial process, claims so outrageous they bordered on delusional. Sarah let the moment hang in the air, allowing the jury to fully absorb what they'd witnessed. Then she delivered the final blow. "Mr. Wellington, do you take any responsibility for your wife's injuries and premature labor?" "I take responsibility for marrying a woman who used pregnancy to trap me and then used her family's influence to destroy my life when I wouldn't submit to her control." The statement was so completely divorced from reality, so utterly lacking in accountability or empathy, that several jury members visibly recoiled. Marcus had just demonstrated why he was dangerous, not just because of his capacity for violence, but because of his complete inability to recognize the humanity of his victims. Karen Mills tried damage control during redirect examination, but the harm was irreversible. Marcus had convicted himself through his own words, revealing the mindset that made domestic violence inevitable. The trial concluded with closing arguments that summarized everything the jury had learned. Sarah Campbell spoke directly to the evidence, reminding jurors of what they'd seen and heard. Marcus Wellington believes his wants matter more than his wife's safety, Sarah concluded. He believes his anger justifies violence. He believes his status entitles him to control another human being. The evidence shows exactly what happens when those beliefs encounter resistance. Mills did her best to argue reasonable doubt, suggesting that Marcus's affair had made him emotional and prone to poor decisions. But that criminal intent was lacking. My client made mistakes, Mills conceded, but mistakes are not crimes. A momentary loss of control during a difficult marriage is not the same as deliberate assault, but the jury had seen too much evidence, heard too much testimony, witnessed too much of Marcus's own character to accept that explanation. After less than 2 hours of deliberation, they returned with guilty verdicts on all charges. Marcus stared at the jury foreman in shock as the verdicts were read. Guilty of domestic assault, guilty of child endangerment, guilty of stalking, guilty of violating protective orders. Judge Hensley set sentencing for the following week, allowing time for pre-sentence reports and victim impact statements. Marcus was remanded to custody immediately. His brief period of freedom while on bail officially ended. Victoria watched her husband being led away in handcuffs, feeling a complex mix of emotions. The man she'd loved, or thought she'd loved, was gone, replaced by someone she barely recognized. But justice was finally being served, not just for her, but for Emma, and for every other woman who'd suffered at the hands of men who believed power gave them the right to hurt others. Eleanor squeezed Victoria's hand as they left the courthouse. "How do you feel, free?" Victoria replied simply. "For the first time in years, I feel free." 1 week later, Judge Patricia Hensley's courtroom was again packed for Marcus Wellington's sentencing hearing. The conviction had made national news, becoming a symbol of how the justice system handled domestic violence cases involving wealthy, privileged defendants. Victoria sat in the front row with Emma in her arms, preparing to deliver a victim impact statement that would help determine Marcus's punishment. She'd spent days writing and rewriting her words, trying to capture not just what Marcus had done to her, but what his actions had cost their daughter. Marcus sat at the defendant's table beside Karen Mills, wearing the same rumpled suit he'd worn throughout the trial. 3 months in county jail awaiting trial had aged him visibly. His face was gaunt, his hair gray at the temples, his expensive dental work unable to hide the stress lines around his mouth. More importantly, his business empire had collapsed completely during his incarceration. Federal investigators had discovered that Wellington Tech's impressive financial statements were largely fictional, built on a foundation of fraudulent investor reports and embezzled funds. The company that had once been valued at $50 million was now worth nothing. Its assets seized to repay defrauded investors. Judge Hensley called the hearing to order with the formal dignity that had marked her handling of the entire case. "We're here for sentencing in the matter of the state versus Marcus Wellington. I've reviewed the pre-sentence report, character letters, and victim impact materials. Are the parties ready to proceed?" Both lawyers indicated they were ready. Mills would argue for the minimum sentence, citing Marcus's lack of prior criminal history and the destruction his conviction had already brought to his life. Sarah Campbell would argue for the maximum, emphasizing the severity of the crimes and Marcus's continued refusal to accept responsibility. "The court will hear from the victim first," Judge Hensley announced. Victoria rose slowly, Emma in her arms, and approached the podium. Her statement was brief but devastating in its simple honesty. "Your Honor, I stood in this courtroom 6 months ago watching my husband lie under oath about what he did to me and our unborn child. Today I stand here as a single mother, raising my daughter in the safety and peace that should have been her birthright. Marcus didn't just push me to the ground that night. He pushed our entire family into chaos and fear. Emma will grow up knowing that her father chose violence when faced with accountability. She'll learn that her mother had to choose between staying with her abuser and protecting her child. But she'll also learn that justice exists, that wealthy men can't buy their way out of consequences for hurting women, that the system can work when good people refuse to look the other way." Victoria paused, looking directly at Marcus for the first time since his arrest. "I forgive you for what you did to me, but I will never forgive you for what you did to our daughter. Emma deserved better from her father." She returned to her seat as Marcus stared at her with something approaching confusion. His narcissistic mind couldn't process Victoria's combination of forgiveness and accountability, her refusal to either excuse his behavior or be consumed by hatred. Mills rose to argue for leniency, emphasizing that Marcus had already lost everything: his business, his reputation, his family, his freedom. Your Honor, my client has been destroyed by his mistakes. Prison will accomplish nothing that hasn't already been accomplished by natural consequences. It was a competent argument, but it missed the fundamental point that Marcus's mistakes were actually choices that had endangered two innocent lives. Sarah Campbell stood to respond with the full authority of her office and her personal commitment to domestic violence prosecution. Your Honor, Marcus Wellington committed violent crimes against his pregnant wife and unborn child. He showed no remorse during trial, continued to harass his victims despite court orders, and has never accepted responsibility for his actions. The defendant's financial losses are not punishment. They're simply the natural result of his criminal behavior being exposed. True justice requires accountability for violence, regardless of the perpetrator's social status or personal losses. Sarah recommended the maximum sentence allowed under state law of 5 years in prison, followed by mandatory counseling and a permanent restraining order. Judge Hensley had presided over thousands of sentencings during her career, but few cases had presented such clear evidence of an abuser's character and the need for meaningful consequences. Mr. Wellington, do you wish to address the court before sentencing? Marcus rose slowly, his movement careful and deliberate. For a moment, Victoria thought he might finally show genuine remorse, might acknowledge the harm he'd caused, and express authentic regret. Instead, Marcus delivered a final demonstration of the narcissistic thinking that had made him dangerous. Your Honor, I've been destroyed by a vindictive prosecution orchestrated by my wife's powerful family. I've lost my business, my reputation, my freedom, all because of one moment of poor judgment during a difficult marriage. My daughter will grow up without her father because her mother chose revenge over reconciliation. Victoria could have sought counseling, could have worked to save our marriage, could have considered what was best for our child. Instead, she chose to destroy me. The statement was breathtaking in its complete absence of accountability, even facing prison. Marcus couldn't acknowledge that his actions had consequences or that Victoria had the right to protect herself and their daughter. Judge Hensley listened without expression, making notes in the case file. She'd heard similar statements from other abusers over the years, the same refusal to accept responsibility, the same tendency to blame victims for the consequences of violence. When Marcus finished speaking, Judge Hensley set aside her notes and addressed him directly. Mr. Wellington, I've presided over domestic violence cases for 2 decades. I've heard every excuse, every justification, every attempt to minimize the serious crime of assault against intimate partners. Your statement today demonstrates exactly why you pose a continuing danger to your wife and child. You show no remorse, no understanding of the harm you've caused, no indication that you've learned anything from these proceedings. You assaulted your 8 months pregnant wife in a public restaurant. You endangered your unborn child. You violated court orders designed to protect your family. And today, you blame everyone except yourself for the consequences of those choices. Judge Hensley's voice carried the authority of years spent protecting vulnerable people from dangerous individuals. The court sentences you to 5 years in state prison on the assault charges, to run concurrently with 3 years for child endangerment and 2 years for stalking. You will serve a minimum of 4 years before becoming eligible for parole. Upon your release, you will be subject to supervised probation for 5 additional years. You are permanently enjoined from contacting Victoria Sterling or your daughter except through court-approved supervised visitation. Assuming you successfully complete anger management counseling and demonstrate genuine rehabilitation, you will pay full restitution for medical expenses, legal costs, and ongoing security measures required to protect your victims. The gavel fell with finality that echoed through the packed courtroom. Marcus stared at Judge Hensley in shock, apparently still unable to process that his wealth and status hadn't protected him from meaningful consequences. As bailiffs approached to escort Marcus back to prison, he made one final, fatal error. His narcissistic rage, suppressed throughout the formal proceedings, finally exploded completely. "This is corrupt." "Error," Marcus shouted, struggling against the bailiffs. "Eleanor Sterling bought this outcome. Victoria is a lying, manipulative..." "Mr. Wellington," Judge Hensley's voice cut through his tirade like steel. "You are in contempt of court. Add 6 months to your sentence." Marcus continued shouting threats and accusations as he was dragged from the courtroom, his final public appearance confirming everything the prosecution had argued about his character and dangerousness. Victoria watched her husband's breakdown with sad clarity. This was who Marcus really was when his carefully constructed facade was stripped away, a man so consumed by narcissistic injury that he couldn't function when the world refused to bend to his will. Outside the courthouse, Victoria spoke briefly to the media gathered on the steps. "Justice was served today," she said simply. "My daughter and I can finally move forward with our lives, knowing that the system worked to protect us when we needed it most." 6 months later, Victoria received a call from Detective Morrison that provided the final chapter in Marcus's story of self-destruction. "The IRS finished their investigation," Paul reported. "Wellington Tech was built on massive fraud, fake investor reports, embezzled pension funds, tax evasion going back years. He wasn't just a domestic abuser, Victoria. He was a white-collar criminal who stole millions from people who trusted him." The news should have been shocking, but Victoria felt only weary recognition. Marcus's willingness to abuse his wife was part of a larger pattern of believing he was entitled to whatever he wanted, regardless of who got hurt. What does this mean for his sentence? Federal prosecutors are preparing additional charges. He's looking at another 10 to 15 years on top of what he got for hurting you. Victoria hung up the phone and looked down at Emma, now walking and babbling her first words. Her daughter would grow up knowing her father was in prison, but she would also grow up in a home filled with honesty, respect, and genuine love. A year after that night at Chez Laurent, Victoria had built a new life that was smaller but infinitely more authentic than her marriage had been. She'd returned to work part-time as a victim's advocate, using her legal skills and personal experience to help other women navigate the complex process of escaping abusive relationships. She'd kept her hyphenated name Sterling Wellington not out of attachment to Marcus, but as a reminder of her own strength and survival. Emma would grow up knowing her full name and her full story, understanding that her mother had chosen courage over comfort, truth over convenient lies. On Emma's first birthday, Victoria sat in the same hospital where her daughter had been born, volunteering with other domestic violence survivors. The work was difficult but meaningful, helping women who faced the same impossible choices Victoria had confronted that night in the restaurant. Emma toddles over with a picture book, her dark eyes bright with curiosity about the world around her. Victoria lifted her daughter onto her lap, opening the book to the first page. "Once upon a time," Victoria read, "there was a little girl whose mommy loved her enough to keep her safe, no matter what it cost." Emma gurgled happily, not understanding the words but responding to the love and security in her mother's voice. Outside the hospital window, the city stretched toward the horizon, full of possibilities and promise. Victoria had learned that love wasn't about accepting everything or forgiving every betrayal. Sometimes love meant having the courage to say enough, to choose safety over social expectations, to protect the innocent even when it broke your heart. As she read to her daughter in the afternoon sunlight, Victoria knew they were both exactly where they belonged, free, safe, and surrounded by people who understood that real love meant never having to choose between your safety and your worth. Justice had been served. But more importantly, a new life had begun, built on the foundation of truth, courage, and the fierce love of a mother who had chosen her child's future over her abuser's comfort. Emma turned the page with tiny fingers, eager for the next part of the story. Victoria smiled and continued reading, knowing that the best chapters of their lives were still being written.